drag up just out of the way. Yeah, like up to.
Oh, I
yeah,
see.
perfect. There you go. Now it's like out of the way.
Well, hello, everyone. This
Hold
is
on
Gordon.
just a second. We're waiting for a couple more to come in,
Oh, I
Gordon,
see.
and then and then we'll go ahead and start out.
Will you
But-
give a little introduction for him,
Yep.
or
Yep,
Okay.
I will be glad to do introductions. So welcome everyone to Smithsonian Gardens Let's Talk Gardens webinar. We have had a delightful conversation already with our guest speaker, Gordon Hayward. Gordon is a person that I am delighted to know, and I am delighted to have visited his garden because he has helped me throughout the years with his design suggestions and his passion for what he's growing. So today, as always, I'm going to ask for you to put your questions in the chat box.
Am I going to
And at the end of Gordon's presentation, we're going to ask him some questions that you put in there. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Manager of Collections and Education at Smithsonian Gardens. And I am delighted to introduce you to Gordon Hayward. As I said, Gordon is a horticulturist extraordinaire, and his gardens, one of the best I've ever seen. So I want to thank you, Gordon, for joining us today and for sharing your information with our delightful audience that's checking in bit by bit. I can see them coming in. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and disappear and leave it up to you and Guillaume. Gordon has a helper today, which is great. Just like Zach is helping me out, Gordon has a helper to keep us on track and be able to share these lovely pictures. So thanks to all of our assistants with our technology and moving forward with such a delightful program this afternoon. So Gordon, like I said, I'll be here, but
Okay.
it's up to you now. Go ahead, tell us all
Right.
about yourself and your garden, and I'll see you at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cindy. My wife, Mary, who's just here to my right, and I welcome you. This is my office in our house in Westminster West, Vermont, in the southeast corner of the state. The lecture I'm giving on the garden room comes out of the last two plus years for all of us gardeners, where the role of the garden in our lives took on a very new place in our attempt to weather the storm of COVID. And so what I'm going to be talking about is making small, intimate spaces in your garden. And what I'd like to do is to start with you thinking about what a room is. So if you could just think about the space where you're sitting right now in your room. First of all, look at the floor. What's on the floor? What materials are on the floor? And how many other floor materials do you have in your house? That is, what we walk on and what we gather furniture on changes according to whether it's a kitchen or a sitting room or a dining room or whatever it might be. So think about what the floor is of your garden room as we develop this idea. Then think about the walls. And the walls of your room may be, in the room you're in now, a different color from that of other rooms in your house. So think about the walls, but also the windows in those walls and the doorways into them. That is that the door is your entry point, and any garden room is going to need an entry point. And when you walk into a room, you're necessarily looking in a very specific direction. So what do you see when you walk in that door? And then notice how windows in the room you're in now frame views out into your garden. The other thing to think about is the ceiling. That is, the ceiling encloses the space overhead. And clearly a garden room may or may not be a solid roof or a solid ceiling as in your room, but nonetheless, It's all part of the enclosure. Then the next thing to think about is what is on the walls of your room that you're in now. That is, oftentimes, as you can see in the paintings that Mary and I have got hanging in our sitting room where we're pictured, these are all images of Vermont agricultural scenes. And so the walls are the place where we often make something very personal, make a personal statement about who we are. And so it's those objects in your house that have personal associations that become very important in a garden room. For example, you might have a peony that your grandmother gave you years ago. And those plants in the garden and those paintings on the walls are where personal associations can become quite powerful. So here's a map that we had done of our garden. And I wanted to just show you the overall sort of direction of the first half of my talk. And it's starting right here by this front door of the house. And it's this line that links a house to the garden. And you can see that the steps are here and they align and come down here to this big apple tree. And this is the 10 X's are garden rooms that we have throughout our garden. And what I want to show you is these that are aligned in terms of the itinerary of the garden. And I should add that Mary grew up in in a little village called Hidcote Boyce outside Chipping Camden in the North Cotswold Hills, literally across the field from the Hidcote Manor Gardens. And that was the first garden of rooms ever planted in England. And Vita Sackville West saw that before she really began to develop Sissinghurst. So that, given that Mary grew up virtually next door to the Hidcote Manor Gardens, she and I have spent a great deal of time there. And that notion of a garden room then really comes from my experience and our experience with Hidcote. So let's start with the first room in our garden. Now, the way I'm going to talk about these is to describe what we have done, but what you need to be doing is thinking about, in this case, where is a wonderful tree that I have out in my garden that could be used as a center for a room. So what Mary and I did in 1984, in the spring of 84, when we first got here, is that we got to this area. It was all brambles and saplings and a complete mess. Everything you see in the garden in 1984 had to be cleared out and taken out, and gradually we put it all into lawn and then began to develop a garden. But what we did under this tree is we tied a string around the trunk of this tree, and we wanted to create a floor, that is a space that answered the shape of this apple tree. So we went out with some string and we ended up finding the 28-foot diameter circle enabled us to turn most of the area under this beautiful tree into a circle. And the walls of this room are all of the garden areas that we planted over the last 35 years. The ceiling of this room is this apple tree. And we don't have any permanent furniture in there in this area because we use this primarily as a place for gatherings for people. So here's an example. This is friends of ours had a wedding under this apple tree. Some of you may know Julie Maservi, the garden designer, but she lives not 10 miles from us, and she calls this our cosmic tree. But you can see that this apple tree branches out and provides shade and a sense of being within a space. And then we garden all around it. And on the day that our friends Seth and Catherine got married, the Joe Pyeweed was in bloom in the garden, and the monarch butterflies were everywhere in the garden that day. So the other point I'd like to make here is that the walls of these garden rooms that you have can be planted with fragrant plants, with flowering plants, with shrubs, with small trees. That is, the walls of your garden room can provide fragrance and vitality as you sit in that space. We also have small gatherings. We have an organization called The Next Stage. It's a sort of cultural performance space in Putney, Vermont. And they had a little event under the apple tree one day with these Indian musicians. So the next room in our garden is admittedly not a modest proposal, but this is a beautiful arbor that we had built by some carpenters, friends of ours, about 25 years ago. And this arbor is framed by a beach tunnel that we have a Stewardia tree growing right next to it. And you can see the wonderful sort of arrival of leaving the apple tree area and coming into the arbor is quite a wonderful experience. And this is where the arbor sits. So I think one thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about where you might put a garden room is where your paths are. And in this case, we created the 2 perennial borders either side of this garden. And it just seems so obvious that we needed a major statement at the end of the path in order to draw people to it. So one question you might ask yourself is, your garden room will draw people to it. Where do you want people to go in your garden to arrive at a garden room? And then also think about, as you can see here, this framing of the arbor, framing a view out into a wonderful meadow. And one of the things that I think we so often forget is that gardens are for people. That is, that what we are doing is making places for people. And we get so caught up in the whole issue of plants and what to plant that we forget that gardens and gardening is really about all our friends, our family, people who come to our garden. And to provide a place of warmth and surrounding is, I think, really an important part of what a garden, why we are gardening. This is the view from the arbor looking north. And I'm going to take you next to a garden room here and a garden room over here. This is our dining area, and a third sitting area is in the herb garden right in here. But my point is that you never want to see any other garden room or garden sitting area from any other place in the garden. Otherwise, you're sending too much information. People need to feel comfortable in one space and then move from that into another. So for example, this is up at the top of the long borders, and we have this sitting area, and you'll might like to see what the progress was and the progression was. This is the apple tree, and all this where you see garden was lawn. And what we realized is that there was a little rise in the land right here. So we decided to put 3 steps, stone steps that would go 1, 2, 3 into and up to this bench. So we did that. And then one of the classic elements of garden design is that people like to have a back to a bench. It's an atavistic response, but we don't want to feel exposed at our backs when we're putting a bench in. So we planted this English hedge maple, which comes right out of the hedges that Mary's father would have planted in their farm in the Cotswolds. We put those behind the bench, And then we created a beach, curved beach hedge on both sides. And gradually this whole thing turned into a room, which you can see over in this photo. So what we've got then is a second sitting area in the same long borders area of the garden that has a completely different feeling to it. This is a dining area, and I think the lesson for you here is that oftentimes it's trees that help you find places to sit. That is, you've got the roof already established. The space between two trees is a window into other parts of the garden. This tree locks up with this, it's an old dead beech tree, a cherry tree rather, that we sent a climbing hydrangea up, and it's now completely covered in about 30 feet up into the air, and that forms another window. And then to my back, when I was taking this photo, was another window. So again, look at the trees in your property. The other thing you might want to look at are where stone walls or hedges might be, and how those might help enclose and form walls to your rooms. So this is an area that's very intimate and yet very open at the same time. And when we have guests for lunch, we often sit at this table, as we did with these wonderful folks from Nantucket. Another thing that we think about when creating a garden room is ornaments or objects in the garden that have personal associations. And we bought this sculpture Hero from Hannah Peshard's sculpture gallery in the southern part of England, and shipped her to our garden in Vermont. And every time we see Hero, we think of that trip that we took to England to see, among other things, Hannah Peshard's extraordinary sculpture gallery. This is the next area. And I think the point for you here is that a garden room could be anchored off any small building that you might have, even a garage or a small shed or an outdoor structure that you might have. This is an 8-foot high, 12-foot wide, 16-foot long, very old 1840 or so tobacco drying shed that was brought up from the flats in Westminster right along the Connecticut River, where they grew tobacco years ago. And what I did here is to use this little building and its proportions to build this entire herb garden. So we took the 8-foot height of this wall, flopped it down, and that's where we planted this viburnum prunifolium hedge. At this end, again, we flopped it down 8 feet, put another hedge in. And so we've got an 8-foot opening, a 16-foot long building, an 8-foot opening, an 8-foot high hedge. Everything fits together. We flopped the wall of this dimension down, and that showed us where to put these 2 posts. And then we built the grape arbor over it, which is directly in sort of historic relationship to this very old little building. And then these beds are basically the size of the garage of this building's door. So the whole thing is put together in proportion, one to the next. And the result is a very intimate space. And this is the view from it. Can you hang that up?
Yeah.
And so this is the view from the bench. And this is a little sculpture that we have of John Tradescant, who was the first English gardener to come to America. He came to Virginia in the 1600s, he being John Tradescant, who was the head gardener for Charles I, and with his father, Charles II. And so there's a whole echo of England. The other point that I'd like to make here is that this is pycnanthemum, which is mountain mint. And it is wonderfully attractive to birds or to butterflies. And so the result is a very lively space. And I think that's a key point about a garden room, is that the space can be planted with plants that will bring birds and butterflies and bees into it. And that oftentimes means flowering shrubs, flowering perennials, water being another part of it. This is a bench that we have next to the herb garden. And some of you might recognize Adrian Bloom, but he was here visiting with Ramsey Yoder, whose company purchased blooms of Bressingham at one point. But the real lesson for you in this picture is, if you intend to seat 3 people on a bench, don't buy a 5-foot bench, buy a 6-foot bench. A garden room could also be as simple as a bench in a bed. That is that I think one of the key problems that we Americans have is that we walk on lawn looking into or looking at our flower beds. Why not put a bench right in those beds so that you can be among your flowers? So the path you see in the foreground here leads directly to that bench. Fragrance of the lilies becomes a big part of that "come this way" message. And the pea stone path again leads you to that room, that bench. Here are 2 other views. And here is that bench. The minute you see that bench, you're drawn to it, and the path is there to lead you to it. And this, I think, is one of the best views in our garden. That is, when sitting on this bench, we see a lot of the structure and the hedges and the flowers that Mary develops over the years. And the result of that is that the bench gives you a very rich point of view. That is, when you set a chair or a bench and a table, what you want people to see is one of the best views from your garden. So maybe using that principle to locate a garden room might be a help. Now, this is a large-scale project. This is 11 acres of meadow that Mary and I own, but I'm going to help you see this as a useful idea for some of you just who may have a small amount of lawn. That is, what we did years ago is we planted 3 oak trees out in this meadow, and we put a bench under those 3. And what I do every other week is to mow this path out to those 3 oak trees. And with that bench sitting under there, you are drawn to it. That is, a lot of you may have more lawn than you really want. And one way to go about that is to perhaps scratch up the surface with some kind of equipment, plant wildflower seeds, and then mow a path out to, say, 3 oaks in what might be too much lawn right now. And the result is that you reduce the amount of mowing that you're having to do, but you also create a room with a lawnmower. That is, that all I do, as I said, is to mow a circle around these 3 trees. And because we had the room, I mow a path right through the meadow every week or every other week. And one of the glories of this area out here is that bobolinks have been for years coming to this section of 6 or 8 acres of meadow and having young there. And so what we do is ask the farmer who mows these fields for hay to hold off until after the 4th of July. And so we have the pleasure of sitting on that bench and listening to bobolinks and watching them fly up to and land on a single blade of grass. It is a marvel to see. The other thing that goes on out in this meadow is swallows. That is, when we bought our place which was built in the 1790s, there were 6 or 8 swallow nests in the barn. And they've been coming there for probably decades. And they're still coming, but all during the day, swallows are out over this meadow getting mosquitoes for this year's young. And there they are. These are this year's young. So it is just such a privilege to be part of their lives for most of the summer. And then one other room that we have in our garden is in fact a room in a barn. And that is, some of you may have a barn, some of you may have a garage or an outbuilding, and it may be very simple to create an opening in a wall for a door that you could open. In this case, we have a double door and you might be able to see the bench, or rather a sofa in here, and we can sit in there and look out when it's raining. So small buildings might be a big help to you. This is what Mary and I bought about 25 years ago. This was a cottage that we purchased in the village of Blockley in Gloucestershire, about 5 miles from where Mary grew up. And this is looking down from the bedroom at what the previous owners of the property had done. And you would sort of think this was a garden room, but I find it anonymous. That turned out to be a really good place, I suspect, to dry laundry. But there's no feeling of intimacy or warmth. There really isn't a floor. There are no views out. There are no windows. There's no particular roof. And so this is what Mary and I did with this space, which is 17 feet across and 35 feet long, which maybe is the size that some of you in the audience might have. But this is what we did with that space. First of all, we made a floor for a circular garden room and put a little stone wall around the edge of it. We put a pot over in here, and what we did was to bring the eye into that area and the body into this area. So there's another view of it. And another point I would make here is that you can just see the corner of a window. This is a long 8-foot wide window into the sitting room, and we centered this table on the center of that window so that it was part of the house. It really is literally a room in the house. The other thing that's important about a garden room is that, and this is the role of prepositions in your garden. Every preposition that you build into a garden gives you a feeling of engagement. So let me show you what I mean by that. First of all, you open this door and you step off the step onto stone, across the stone, down the step, across the stepping stones, up this step, between the walls, onto the circle, and you arrive at the table. And every one of those experiences increases that sense of distance between the two and forces you to pay attention to where you're moving. But what we've also got here is a hierarchy of sitting. That is a seating for one person, for two people, and for four people. And so there's a hierarchy of meaning for each of these. And I would call that a garden room, made up of 3 smaller rooms. So there's another shot of it. And you can see that flowering shrubs, trees overhanging the walls of existing stone structures was always so satisfying and so embracing. So I think the point also here of this is that a garden room need not be a tiny room. They can be, in this case, 17 feet by 35 feet. But it's the amount of enclosure that you create and the view lines from it that turn it into a room. So here's a family gathering. This is Mary, her sister Sue, her brother Simon, and her sister Kim. And this is Sue's husband Terry and Dim's children. And this old gent here is Jim, and it was his birthday. So we invited them all here, and this is what Jim is looking at. What we did was to frame the view of the Blockley Church and extended that room. In fact, organized a lot of the sitting in that room around that church, in part because it's a beautiful building, but some of you who may be watching or have watched Father Brown, the priest who solves mysteries, this is his church, and the village of Blockley was his village and still is. I guess they're on another series of episodes. So now I'd like to look at a variety of different rooms in relation to the house. So keep in mind your own house as we go through these slides. This is Nick Williams Ellis, just down the street from us in Blockley. And what Nick did when he rebuilt what was the old post office, is that he included at the end of his kitchen folding doors that could be folded completely out of the way, so that the kitchen and the garden room outside became one. This is their dog Harry, hoping somebody will come play with him. And this is Jenny, Nick's wife, and Mary sitting, and there's the folding doors right there. So in other words, the space right off your kitchen could become a garden room. This is Sybil Kreutzberger and the late Pamela Schwartz garden. These two ladies were the head gardeners for Vita Sackville West at Sissinghurst for 35 years. And this is what Sybil and Pam designed right outside their sitting room window. So think about your sitting room window. They have a door right over here, and that whole small garden is aligned with that sitting room window. And the result is that the relationship between inside and outside, that relationship between an inner room and an outer room, is pretty wonderful. This happens to be the Chevy Chase Garden Club that Mary and I took to England to look at gardens. This is Sybil Kreutzberger, who is now 92, Mary?
Yeah.
She's 92. She's living nearby. She sold this property years ago. But this is Tel Zeiler, who I think is in the audience today, and Doreen Hamilton and a few other members of the Chevy Chase Garden Club. And right behind it is a table, and the notion of offering people something to eat and drink when visiting your garden room is classic. And what Sybil had done was to bring out the tea set that Vita Sackville West had given her, so that we could all drink tea from that august pot. These are friends of ours from Nantucket, and this is the notion of a garden room as a deck right off the house, I think, is a classic, and many of you may well have built a deck right off your house. But I think that what David and Beverly have done here takes it to another level. That is, that if you've got a deck, that doesn't mean you've got a room. And what they have done is to plant densely on all sides, even a small Japanese maple. And notice all the detail in the plant, in the decorating of this room. But this is an important thing right here, is that this is an enclosure. This bench forces the eye back into this space. This all holds your eye. Do you see how this is a living room with these are folks who are devoted to Chinese history and art. And so they brought some elements of the outside, from the inside into the outside, to create a very rich room. And if you think you've seen a table set for lunch, take a look at what David did. This is a man who knows to set a table. Now I want to look at a couple other properties. This is a house
I am just tell him. Hey, I love you. I love it when you have a smile on your face.
What can we do?
I think there was someone is
You're being
unmuted.
What is it?
Someone in the audience is unmuted. If you want to just double check that you're all muted. We're getting some talking coming through.
What I did here and what you could do is that this is a property, 700 or 220 acre property with looking east to the whole flank of the north side of Mount Monadnock. It's a big space. It's in New Hampshire. And people like to see big views from little places. So what I did here is I took this dimension and I flopped that dimension down and created a stone wall here. I measured that and flopped that dimension and put a stone wall along there, and we created a sitting area right in there. And the result is that these stewardias, underplanted with boxwoods, create a very warm, cozy, enclosed space to look out at the big view of Mount Monadnock. As it turns out, birds love these trees and their fruits on the stewardias. From the kitchen window, the family can watch birds. They've actually had a couple nests being built just outside that window. So what might be a big space now in your garden could be turned into an intimate garden room. Here's another example of a design I did on Lake Winnipesaukee up in New Hampshire. And what I did here was to flop this dimension down and double it. And we built this stone retaining wall, and this corner of the sitting room established that corner of the little garden room outside. So in other words, the proportions of the house and the garden room are in direct relationship to one another. This is the next point, is thinning out of branches. An arborist was brought in to thin out these branches, but not make it too overdone, but keep it quite open so you could see the lake while sitting here with friends for dinner. But notice that if this had been lawn, that would have been a real fuss to maintain. So by putting stone down, you have a floor, you have the walls, you have the ceiling, and you have the view from the inside into the outside. This is different Fernand in Pembrokeshire in Wales. And what these folks did in this historic garden is they literally measured that wall of the house and flopped it down onto the ground. And that point up here drove the position of this stone wall out here. This wall drove that wall, and on. So if you're in suburban America or anywhere in the suburbs, this might be a beautiful way to have a lovely garden at the front of the house. And what you might do is to plant 3 or 4 crab apples along the front to give you more screening against the traffic in the street. But what a wonderful way to enter the house through your garden room. This is an extraordinary project. Christine Froelich lives up near Rochester, New York, and she created across the entire front of her house, she created a garden room, and that hedge is 3 feet from the street, the side of the street outside her house. So from the front of her house to the edge of the street is perhaps 20 feet. And yet look what she has created in this marvelous garden room that's long and narrow and gives Christine, who is a garden designer, all this wonderful space to create privacy, fragrance, foliage, color. It just couldn't be more wonderful. This is a client I had down in Hingham, Mass, and her father was Italian, and they are decorating their house in an Italian style. And so what we did was to use the entrance garden and the boxwood and yew hedge to create an entry garden, a space that was private and welcoming and enclosed. And here's the garage over here on a complete different angle from the front wall of the entry porch of the house. So what we did was to just put this garage completely into the background at its own angle and just didn't pay any attention to it. And the result is a very welcoming arrival space and a garden room. George Sholkoff, who's got this wonderful historic house in the suburbs or in Connecticut, Washington, Connecticut. This is a garden overseen by the Garden Conservancy. And here is a wall of his house. Think about an exterior wall of your own house with a tree off one corner. If you came out 16 or 18 feet and enclosed that space, as George has done, with a stone wall or with a hedge or whatever, your garden room could be directly off an interior room of your own house. This is Tim Cole's garden just down the road, about half a mile from ours. This is a garden I helped design with Tim. And what's going on here is that these honey locusts were a favorite plant. Dan Kiley, who was a very important garden designer who was from Charlotte, Vermont, up north. And Tim Cole's family and Dan Kiley's family lived very close to one another and were great friends. And Tim was Dan Kiley's translator when Kiley was working on the area just past the Arc de Triomphe in Paris called La Défense. And Dan Kiley's link then to Tim Cole's was important. And so Dan used the honey locust a lot. So we planted honey locusts in part to give shade to these big windows during the summer. And then because they were very open growing plant, when they lose their leaves, sun would just pour into these windows. But my point here is that the shape of the garden room right outside the house is roughly the same shape as this three-sided section of Tim's house. And then we paved it and then put thyme, Hall's woolly thyme went all through this. And gradually we expanded that out into a larger garden. At Colonial Williamsburg, they did a beautiful thing with a garden between two buildings, that is a circle and a square. So if you have a garage and a house near one another, that's a classic way to create a beautiful sitting room that you would walk through when you parked your car and walked toward the side door of the house every evening. This is a garden room that I designed out in Palo Alto. And these were folks who wanted to be able to sit outdoors because the weather is so perfect there. And so what we did was to use the side door of the sitting room and drove that line right across and out into that space. So when they're in the sitting room, they're looking out at the walkway and steps that draw you out into this area. Furnishings are another important part of all of a garden room and should play some role, some relationship to the furnishings and the style of your house. So I'm going to close with a few very simple ideas. This is a garden room made simply with a hammock. It couldn't be simpler. 4 chairs at the edge of your property where you may have a lovely view. This is in Booth Bay Harbor. This is Lyndon Miller's garden. What she did here was to stop mowing lawn, planted wildflower seeds, but continued to mow a lawn path to an arbor and a lovely bench at the end of a crossing of 2 other paths in the garden. But there's a good lesson for you on letting some of your lawn grow. This is Frank Cabot's playful sitting area, a little special room for the friendly frog. If any of you have water, a little pool or pond near you or on your property, I thought this was a lovely idea. Here's the roof. It's a tree branching overhead. They built a little floor of simply laid stone and a very simple stone retaining wall, roughly 2 feet high, for the bench and the back for the bench. I can't tell you the number of pools and ponds I have seen that did not have sitting areas near them. It makes all the difference. And I'd like to just show you our final room in our garden. I took this shot from a ladder, but this is a little pool with a bubbler in an old mill wheel that we set into the midst of this pool. And we sit on these 4 teak chairs. And every evening, this is facing west. So when you're developing your garden room, keep in mind that if the sunset is important to you and it's glorious, get chairs that will face west. If you're having breakfast in your garden room, make sure you've got a chair and a window that opens east. That is, pay attention to the 4 points of the compass. The floor is pea stone under the ashes and the maples that are in here. The roof of the room is the branching of these trees. So the whole thing is enclosed, but at the same time, quite open. Every night we sit out here and birds perch on this stone and then have a bath or they drink water. We've seen chipmunks on the top of sitting on Buddha's head. There's just a whole lot of wildlife gathered around water. This is a sculpture of the Green Man, which is a classic Druidic image of the place where man and the world of plants come together. Mary has visited many cathedrals, as have Mary and I, and seen the Green Man and the roof bosses of great cathedrals of Europe, such as Ely Cathedral. And so we had a friend of ours carve this Green Man into the trunk of a dead butternut tree. And the result is that this object has deep meaning for us. This tree, a Japanese tree lilac, was given to us 36 years ago in the form of a 3/4 inch seedling by Howard Andrus, my mentor, who taught me a lot about plants. Every time I see that tree, I think of Howard. There's a yellowwood tree. One of the first articles I wrote about for Horticulture Magazine was the yellowwood tree. My point is, find objects that are important and speak to you as a person. And we also have had on many occasions been able to use our garden rooms as places for performances. This is a puppet show that was in this garden, that the little pool is right behind the stage. So the garden room can also be a performance space. And this is how much people enjoyed it. This is Cindy Stam, who's now a garden designer here in Southern Vermont, but she is having a terrific time. So I thought I'd close with this image. That is, that do whatever you can to bring birds into your garden, and particularly into your garden room. I was about to photograph this wisteria in another part of our garden, and I was just about to click the trigger on my camera when this cardinal landed in the scene and just lit it up. So do what you can to help the birds. Thank you.
Gordon, thank you for a lovely presentation. Again, you've invigorated me and caused me to think what else I can do in my own garden. And there were so many lovely questions, but I really like the fact that you pointed out a garden room isn't just a collection of plants. A garden room is a place where you're inviting your friends, inviting people in. A garden is for people, and give them views of what's outside. And I love one of the last questions. They're saying that these are all lovely homes. What do you do if you have an ugly home? Well, I must tell you, my townhouse is not that gorgeous. Yet I would put my garden up with anybody's because it is something that brings me joy. And whether my house looks like one of the beautiful houses that you showed or not, the garden is what I want the people to look at, to participate in, and forget about whatever's behind it for the house that goes along with it. So let's remember that we might not all have the perfect spot like you were showing us, but do what you can to make your garden an invitation to people, birds, bees, all of those like you suggested. So thank you for that. And we do have a couple questions I wanted to share with you. One is a question about how you're creating this. And it reiterates what you said. If I understand it, you have not only rooms, but a place where you have a wide view as well, which is something that people value in a home as well. So balance is important, is it not?
Oh, indeed, indeed. And I think that one of the issues that was brought up by the lady or the person who said she doesn't have a grand house is that what you are developing in a garden room is a garden island. That is, that you are in an enclosed space, and that could perhaps set your house into the background by putting the garden room fairly close to it. But then you are in control of what people see from inside the garden space by where you put your windows. Mm-hmm. And so you de-emphasize the house and you emphasize the best view you have or the best plants that you have that you prune holes through or gaps through so that you can see out into the landscape. So I wouldn't apologize for your house for a minute in relation to this idea of a garden room.
I agree. This is very time for us that live in small houses. We have all the necessities that are outside, garbage cans, telephone poles, things like that we think are distracting from a garden room. So what advice do you have if you have a nice sized backyard, but you have to have that air conditioning unit and all those other things that make your home more livable?
Yeah, I've always used wooden fencing around those and then put vines on the fences. And it solves the problem very quickly.
Mm-hmm. I had a friend that used bamboo.
Yeah.
Dead bamboo. He made a bamboo fence.
Yeah, it could be cedar fence. It could be whatever fence you've already got on the property, repeat it. But then the result is that you just don't see those. But one thing I would do is probably not put any garden room near air conditioning units or any units that are going to create a lot of sound and worrying machinery noise. But and that's another thing I didn't bring up maybe is that where are you going to put the garden room? And if you're going to entertain and you're going to have a table and chairs in it, you're going to want it not all that far from the house. If you have a fabulous view at a great distance from the house, fine, then people have to walk there and they would love every minute of arriving there. So think about how you're going to use the space when thinking about where to put it.
Yeah. How about, I know I've made mistakes in my garden and ripped them out. How about you? Have you ever made a mistake and you ripped it out and start all over again?
How about last week?
Okay,
how about last week?
So you're continuing to learn.
Oh yeah, we had an area and I just realized this never worked. We tried to cover it up and that's it. It's time.
Yeah.
So out it came.
That's a really good point. I have found when I'm helping people design gardens, they try to cover up some of the mistakes.
Yeah.
No, don't. Bring somebody else in and have them look at it with you, and they're going to state the obvious. Why are you keeping it? Just rip it out. I'm like, okay, so we'll continue to make mistakes and correct them. A garden is never finished, is it?
No, indeed.
No, it isn't. Okay, I'm looking again. So another question that we had, have you incorporated any native plants in your garden? And I've seen a bunch in your garden.
Yes, well, the pycnanthemum in the herb garden is native to New Hampshire. The entire garden room under those three oak trees out in the meadow is meadow. So every plant is native that's out there. No particular seeding has ever gone on out there. So that whole garden under the three oak trees is a native garden. And I think that's a point Doug Tallamy makes, is the oak tree is one of the most important trees to be planting. 400 different creatures have been seen in a single oak tree by Doug Tallamy. And so to use those native trees to provide you with a context for a garden room couldn't be better.
I agree. Okay, now make us all feel bad. Tell us you do all that work all by yourself. You and Mary.
Well, we do. We do 98% of all the work ourselves. Having said that, Guillaume has prepared to climb an 18-foot stepladder and to stand on the top step and prune our fastigiate oak.
Good.
So,
good. I don't want to read about you in the paper.
that is beyond me at this point. But yes, we are doing it pretty much all on our own. We do have a young woman. We're in our late 70s, and we have a young woman coming every Wednesday this year. But it's a 40-hour-a-week job to keep this place going. I guess one point I would make is that a garden room sometimes is really helpful because you can hide in the garden room and only see what you know you can maintain well. So yeah, we do a lot of work, and then we're a little obsessed, but
that's all right. It's great.
We're also I'm largely no longer designing gardens. Mary stopped teaching in the two-room schoolhouse in our village 11 years ago, so we're home full time now, pretty much.
And it keeps you young. I know that.
Indeed.
You know, working in the garden, it definitely keeps you young.
And I would suggest that for the audience to take a close look at Sue Stuart Smith's The Well-Gardened Mind, The Restorative Power of Nature. That is an extraordinary book about the solace and the peace and the mental health that comes from gardening. And also, I had met that 82-year-old mentor, Howard Andrus, told me that he said, promise yourself that every evening you will go out into your garden, leave the pad and pencil in your office. Don't walk into the garden saying to yourself, oh, I should have done that. I was going to do this. That is, don't make the late day visit to your garden guilt-inducing. Just be in the garden and don't call, and enjoy what you have created.
I would agree with that totally. You get so caught up in pulling weeds and doing everything else, you forget to just stop and enjoy. And
list making.
Yes.
We're big at list making.
Yes.
It drives us crazy. Leave the list in the office and go out with no pencil, no paper.
A glass of wine.
Yes, and be.
I agree. Or a cup of coffee. Keep your hands busy with a drink so you aren't.
And no phones, exactly.
And no phones. No phones.
I might add, I have never bought a cell phone. I do not have one.
That's a time. I haven't been able to do that, but I know that I don't carry it with me on walks
Right.
or in the garden. Well, Gordon, thank you so much for a lovely visit. I really truly feel like I'm back in your garden and just having a conversation. So thank you for that.
Wonderful.
And
Thank you
all
for
of our
having me.
visitors.
And thank you to Guillaume.
And thank you to Guillaume, exactly. And to Zach too. So, and thank you all for visiting us. And we hope to see you again next week. Gordon, you have an
Bye-bye.
enjoyable time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.